Hello everybody, Ian here. Today we're going to talk about the alleged leak from the Joint Chiefs of Staff of secret slides from one of their briefings about the ongoing operations in Ukraine. In this video I'm going to talk about if I think the slides are real and not a fake. I'll give the reasons why. I do think it's real. However, I'll also give some evidence that I'm wrong and it is actually a fake. I'll give reasons for that as well. After that, I will go over the information presented in these slides, what the terminology means, and what conclusions we can draw from it. So, to begin with, let's talk about what happened. So, earlier this week, and this is me reading off of the blog of a son of the American Revolution, solar21.com, and he reported on this yesterday. It popped up on Donbass Devushka, which is a popular pro-Russia Telegram channel, and these photos show what are purported to be photos that were taken of printed copies of slides presented to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Biden administration has reacted to it and is apparently making efforts to shut down any references to these slides, and that might end up including this video, so we'll see. This is actually a bit of a test to see how effective their efforts are. However, I haven't seen anyone talk about these slides in depth or what all this gibberish on the pages means, because I think to the average person they're going to look at this word salad and have no idea what they're looking at, and I don't even blame them. Now first off, I do think, and that actually leads me right into my next point, I do think these are real, and my chief reason for thinking they're real is that they're a nightmare to read. This kind of administrative, jargony gibberish is something that would have to be written by an insider. I don't think anyone who doesn't have first-hand experience with the nightmare that is creating PowerPoint slides for a higher headquarters presentation is going to be able to replicate it as well. And when I look at it, I see the jargon, I see the acronyms, I see just the conventions that are used, and it makes me, my first impression is that I think it is genuine. This is a real briefing that's happened. Now with that, and also I'll add that I could not find any obvious mistakes. For example, this does, as far as I can tell, this is the correct letterhead to use, the classification markings, the acronyms, the units, the conventions the military uses to talk about things all seem to be correct here. And also there's no spelling or grammar mistakes that I could detect here, because that's another thing to look at. A lot of times fake news that someone tries to copy an official document and they'll have spelling mistakes in it. And the reason why that proves it's not an official document is because there's these briefings and memorandums are all carefully proofread by multiple people, especially when they're going to be viewed by senior people. So if you're creating a slide for some of the most senior military commanders in the world, and you have stupid spelling mistakes on your slide, your boss is going to get mad at you and yell at you, call you stupid, and tell you to do it again. So I don't see any of that here. So I don't see any obvious indications that these are fake. Now there is a lot of detail in the way these were set up. So for example, you can see how this crumpled up paper was folded up, presumably put in someone's pocket and taken out of his workspace. Now this would be a digital presentation and a PowerPoint slide on a display screen in a conference room. However, it's not implausible that there would be printed copies in existence. In fact, there would almost certainly be printed copies in existence. You'd have some prints on the table for people who want one so they can write notes on it, so they can read it at their own pace, go back and look at past information. It's just more, it's for convenient. They're essentially working copies, especially when your boss sees something on the slide he wants changed, or sees some information you presented and gives you a task based on this information. You can write that down right there on your copy of it. So it's completely believable that these would be printed. They would, of course, be printed on, since these are secret classified documents, they would, of course, be printed from printers on the same network. And so this is a nice, pretty color-coded presentation, so they would be printed in color, of course, as opposed to black and white. If it was a text document, like an operations order, a frago, it could be black and white, but for something like this, where it's very visual oriented, it would be color, of course. So all these little details make sense. However, if this was someone trying to fake a briefing and fool people into thinking it's real when it's not, he could, in fact, put more effort into these little details, like the way it's folded sloppily. This is a common tactic for people trying to produce convincing fakes. I'll give you an example. Like if I made a fake video of an alien spaceship in my backyard, or aliens coming out and talking to me, what I would do is I wouldn't use a professional camera on a tripod. I would use my cell phone, and there would be visible camera movement, and that's an example of a detail that would make people subconsciously think it's real. They would see the camera moving in my hand as I'm talking to the aliens, and they would say, well, it would be very hard for this guy to fake aliens and have camera movement. How could you have your camera movement and have convincing aliens in the video? Of course, it is possible to fake, and that's actually deliberate. People will sometimes, when they want to make a fake video, they'll make the camera look like it was moving when it was not. They'll actually make that camera jitter effect as they're editing the video, just to make people believe it's more amateurish than it actually is, and believe it's real. So if this was a fake, that's something someone could have done. You'll notice that these look like he put it out on a table or some sort of flat surface and took the photos, possibly with a camera or with his phone. And what's interesting is what you can see in the background. So this could, I guess, be carpet or flooring of some sort. But there's other details, like there's this target. This looks like a pretty standard hobby target you could get in almost any sporting goods store in the United States. There's another one here. Here, you see this a partially obscured branding logo. It looks like it could be some sort of a sporting goods brand. It could be a hunting club or something like that. And that's actually so. And those are more examples of details. Someone would say this. Oh, this was whoever leaked this to the public. He took this at his house, and that might convince people that it's authentic. However, that could also prove the opposite, because if I was a spy in the highest echelons of the Department of Defense, I would not do this. I would crop these, or better yet, I would just clear the damn table before I took the photo, because these are details that could be very easily traced back to the person responsible. And if it is indeed an authentic leak and the Biden administration has all of his alphabet people looking for the culprit, these are clues they could use to trace it back to him. Just looking at these. So, for example, okay, so if there's targets here and that's other hunting brands, that tells me, okay, this is probably a person who is a shooting enthusiast. He probably has guns at his house. He's probably a conservative. He's probably a patriot. He's probably someone who likes America very much and is upset that we're being dragged into an unnecessary war with Russia. So that's a huge amount of information about this person just from looking at the crap on the margins of the pictures. And that almost leads me to wonder if these are faked, because it just seems like such a stupid mistake for a person to make if he's leaking these. Though there's other explanations as well. Maybe he is just genuinely dumb. Or possibly these are photos that were not intended to be leaked. Like, this could just be someone being sloppy. For example, this could be someone, because you're of course not allowed to take classified information from your workplace out of that secure area, let alone take it home with you. However, it's possibly someone who is working and is a workaholic and broke the rules, was working from home, or possibly it was a guy who texted his buddy, hey, I need those slides from yesterday's briefing. Could you just text them to me? It could just be spillage. It could just be accidental spillage. Someone taking a photo and sending it to his buddy, and that got hacked or got otherwise spilled to a place it wasn't intended. So that's another possible explanation. However, my overall assessment is that these are almost certainly authentic. These are so authentic. It's also something to bear in mind that these might have been a deliberate leak. It could be deliberate military deception to make the Russians think one thing and we actually do something different. Especially with the time frame we're talking about here. These are somewhat old. I mean, they're almost ancient history. These are briefings from the end of February and the beginning of March. That's a long time ago. This could have been entirely deliberate. And however, with that said, it's hard for me, aside from military deception, it's hard for me to think of any actual motivation for someone to leak these. There's really no clear person who benefits from this. If it was Russian sources who were responsible for the leak, it really doesn't actually make sense for them to leak it rather than keep it for themselves. If you leak information you got your hands on, you're telling the enemy that you have access to insider information, and it's not generally a good idea to tell them that you do. And it's really, what did they gain from it? If it's a non-state entity like a blogger, Donbass Devushka on Telegram, or somebody like that, well, okay, what do they really gain from this? I mean, they go viral, that's cool. There's really no monetary gain here. There's not even click traffic. If like when I make this video, for example, I always link to my own blog. There's no even any particular website this is affiliated with. So all these people are talking about this leak, but they're not visiting any particular website besides the Telegram channels sharing it. But again, anybody on social media, what they typically do is they'll just download the photo and share it from their own page. So even the person who originated these photos isn't even benefiting from that traffic. I'll give a couple examples. Like there was, years ago, there was an alleged leak of Russian war casualties in 2014. That originated from a Russian blog. It turned out to be fake, and he was just doing it because he wanted a lot of people to click and look at his website. So this is actually very common on social media. You'll see a lot of missing children reports that are faked. You'll see a picture of a sad little girl. Oh, poor Elma is missing. Please pray for her. And it'll often include, if you have information, click on this link. And of course, the link goes to a malicious site or just a website someone wants to clickbait people into going to. But I don't see anything like this. There's really no one who plausibly benefits from this, which is another reason that I have to conclude that it was genuinely made by someone on the inside, which leaves the only two options of this is in fact a real briefing or it's a very clever attempt at military deception. Now, with that said, I'll go into some of the information. I'm going to start, and first off, just glancing at these slides. First off, they are a little stale. So there's apparently two separate briefings here, jumbled together. There are allegedly more slides that were leaked. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any besides what Donbass Devushka posted on Telegram in that post I just showed you. But there's two dates. There's one for 28th of February, and there's another one for the 1st of March. And I will just say that's I know that's a really, really bizarre, I know that's a really bizarre date time group format, but that is correct. That is how American military units describe the time. That first number is the day of the month. That second one is the time of day in a 4-digit 24-hour format. The third group of letters there is the time zone. So this is Eastern Standard Time on the East Coast, which makes sense if this is the Joint Chiefs of Staff for March, and the last two numbers are the year. Now, that said, I'll go back to. And first off, I'm not going to go into. I'm going to actually go into one of these other slides first, because it's got the kind of meat and potatoes of the overall. At least the fragments of the presentation we're seeing here. However, I'm going to start really first by mentioning this heading on the first one. So this is from a daily update given to the Joint Staff J3, 4, and 5. For people who don't know what the heck J3, 4, and 5 is, those are staff sections. So a commander has a headquarters underneath him, and this headquarters is divided into different sections. Each section has a different job. So, for example, your J1 section would be personnel or human resources in civilian terms. You'd have another one, for example, J8, finance section. They deal with soldiers' pay and budget. In this case, you have J3, 4, and 5. So J3 is operations, J4 is logistics, and J5 is planning. And I'll go back to hitting this other slide first. First slide I want to talk about is this one, and this is one of the most interesting ones. So this is this is possibly the most confusing slide too. It's got a huge amount of information on it. However, I'll break it down for you. So this is just a little this up here. This is just a synopsis of what's going on, and essentially, long story short, there are 12 Ukrainian brigades being built up for the scheduled spring counteroffensive. Out of these 12, 9 are being equipped by the U.S. and allies and partners. 6 of these brigades will be ready by the end of March, with another 3 ready by the end of April. Now again, I'll break down the other sections here. So this left-hand third of the page is giving information on the individual brigades, what they're comprised of. This middle section is the timeline. This is a calendar. So you see, it's like what you would see Microsoft like your Microsoft scheduling. Any kind of scheduling software has a similar format to this. Each one of these blocks represents a training or a task that's supposed to happen, and the block of time supposed to happen from January to March. And then over here at the end of the calendar, you have notes, which basically just explains points made in the previous columns. Now in each row, you see a different Ukrainian brigade. These are the 9 brigades specifically being equipped and trained by NATO. The 3 brigades that Ukraine is training themselves is not listed, and that makes sense because they're not pertinent to the information in this slide. Now there's a few interesting details here that immediately leap out to me. The first one is that these are not standard, these Ukrainian brigades are not configured the way American combat units would, because yes, the American Army does have brigades, infantry brigades, and whatnot, but those are administrative units. They don't go into combat like that. They deploy as brigade combat teams. infantry brigade combat teams, armored brigade combat teams, and so on. And of course, there's other configurations which is also affected by the branch of service, like you have Marine Expeditionary Forces, you have task forces, and so on. But these actually look very Russian, actually. Now, you can, for example, look at how Ukrainian brigades, and by the way, these are all real Ukrainian unit designations, by the way. So if this was faked, whoever did an outstanding job, because these are real designations, and this is actually pretty consistently true around the world. There's a tendency to not just make up new unit names out of nothing. They tend to recycle them. So even after a unit is disbanded, because it's peacetime, it's not needed anymore, there's a cutback in forces, they'll save that name, and then when they do increase the size of the military again, they'll reintroduce that brigade, and that's also kind of a way to increase morale in the unit, because you have that long heritage of the previous wars and campaigns that unit had fought in. Previous generations of soldiers in that same unit had fought, and so that, but anyways, back to my point I was getting at by bringing up this Wikipedia page. I will say that, and I've been saying this for years, by the way, more than 2 years I've been saying this, that it's dangerous, especially with Ukraine, to try to make any kind of assumptions about how their military is configured and how their units are structured just from what's available on social media online, even from official Ukrainian sources, because they tend to contradict each other. They're very often made up. There's often debates on if certain Ukrainian units even exist. It's that bad. So if you look at the way this brigade, there's a lot of things listed, all of the things you would need for a self-contained brigade. You have your logistics, your engineers, your signal, your radar, your medical, your CBRN. If you go back and look at the way they're listed here, these are obviously not complete units. These are not self-contained entities. You can't go into any kind of mission with just tanks, some armored personnel carriers, and artillery. You need obviously many other components. However, that doesn't mean this is fake or that these units were configured wrong. Of course, that's not true. What's much more likely is that these are incomplete inventories just listed for the sake of this briefing. And a good commander will actually demand that in the slides that come across on the screen. He'll demand that of his, or actually more specifically, probably not the commander himself, probably his executive officer who's taking more of a personal role in organizing the meeting, and the officers and presenters involved. He will demand that only include information that's relevant to what we're talking about. So that would entirely make sense that he would just tell these people, if it's not relevant to these Lend-Lease vehicles, if it's not relevant to the training we're offering, don't even include it on the slide. I don't even want to see it on the slide. For example, if the 33rd Brigade is getting 100 Honda pickup trucks from the scrapyard, I don't care. I don't want to see it on the slide. It's not relevant to what we're talking about. So when you don't see, like, for example, logistics, vehicles and equipment listed, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it's not relevant to what they're talking about. Though there is an alternative explanation that there is logistics support, there is medical support and so on, but it's not organic to these units. It's being provided by someone else. But I think that's unlikely. A brigade is a very large unit. It's supposed to be self-contained. The existence of those other components is just implied here. It just doesn't happen to be listed. Now that said, let's look at the equipment that's spelled out here. So I do want to bring up a writer I do particularly enjoy, Carl Hamilton. He's a military historian who blogs on Quora. He's been pretty on the nose with how accurate his various commentaries and even most of his predictions about what's happening in Ukraine. And one thing he did say pretty early on is that when you get these random assortments of equipment from and vehicles from different countries, they don't get spread out all over the place. They tend to be concentrated because you don't want to take, for example, 50 Leopard tanks and spread them out to different brigades, because it's very hard to support logistically when you have one brigade with multiple types of tanks that are not interoperable in terms of maintenance and ammunition and supply. So he was absolutely correct. The way that they sent, for example, Leopards, they concentrated the Leopard tanks into one brigade. They concentrated T-55s into another brigade, T-64s into another brigade, and so on. Polish tanks into another one. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is the way that they are comprised. So like I said earlier, this is not how an American fighting unit would be set up. And the reason why I say that is because you can see here, let me explain, and I'm sorry I should have done this earlier, I'll explain what these symbols mean. So when you see an X, a rectangle with an X, that implies infantry in a NATO map symbol. So an X means infantry, an oval means armor, mechanized, and when you have an X and an oval overlaid with each other, that means mechanized infantry. The little dot, that means artillery. The symbols above the rectangle indicate what echelon a unit it is, a platoon, a company, a battalion, and so on. So in this case, these are brigades, and these little double tick marks indicate these are battalions. So each brigade has 3 battalions. Now, this is, again, I emphasize, this is not an American convention, and I will show you an example of what an American unit would look like. Fairly large organization with many different battalions. You still only have one fires battalion, an artillery battalion, and that's not very many. So you have to think you have all these different maneuver battalions, vehicles and infantry, and only one artillery battalion to support all of them. That's because the United States is very much an air power focused fighting force. Russia, however, is a very artillery focused. And of course that's deliberate. So the Russians go into a theoretical fight with NATO, assuming that NATO will have air superiority. So they deliberately focused on massing artillery and air defenses. So if you look at the way Russian units are set up, they have much more. They often have as much as a 1-to-1 ratio between their maneuver units and the artillery supporting them. And that's, interestingly, what looks like happened here. There's only 2 maneuver units. There's only 2, so that's a 1-to-2 ratio between artillery and maneuver elements. Now, that said, the artillery situation is not looking great. It's a mishmash. You see a lot of different platforms in use. You have these Ukrainian D-30s, you have these Soviet-era 2S-1s, which is a self-propelled unit. Makes sense, put a self-propelled artillery unit with a mechanized brigade that's going to be on the move a lot. However, you have a lot of M119s, which are, it's not an ideal heavyweight gun to bring into a maneuver war with a peer or near peer opponent. It's just not good. And actually the situation gets worse when you bring up tanks. Of course, there's T-55s. I actually find this hilarious because social media has been full of accusations that the Russians are so desperate they're bringing T-55s into the battle, when really the opposite is true. We're bringing T-55s into Ukraine. They're not even hiding it. I mean, it's in the news too. It's just, and these other brigades are in even worse condition. Strikers are okay, but they're not great. Max Pros. A Max Pro is a very heavy and top-heavy, four-wheeled vehicle. It's not, width is extremely limited in what kind of armament it can carry. It's not vehicle. I mean, it's good for what it was designed for, which was going on convoys across Iraq or Afghanistan, where they use a lot of improvised explosive devices, stacking mines, and ensures excellent crew survivability if it's hit by a roadside bomb. However, it's not something you would want to be rolling around Ukraine with. It protects you from IEDs, but it doesn't protect you from much else, and it's not going to hold up well against actual infantry fighting vehicles like BMPs, even old ones. And it's kind of the same situation with most of these other vehicles listed, especially the M113. It's a Vietnam-era vehicle that's not even resistant against higher caliber weapons. It's not. It's a very desperate loadout to send people into a conventional war with. Now, a quick note about the training calendar. I think it's self-explanatory. So if you say, for example, there's 4,000 soldiers in one of these brigades, it doesn't mean every single one of them is attending these different training blocks. It's just for who's relevant. So, for example, you might have a week-long driving course. You might have a night driving course, a night shooting course scheduled for different days. And of course, when these Ukrainians go to these training events themselves at the various countries hosting them, you would of course have more detailed calendars breaking down what these blocks of training included and the relevant people for each training event. Now, the notes are interesting, and you can see some of the problems with having such a mishmash of vehicles and guns. Trying to find the relevant ammo for them, it can be easier said than done. So, for example, they seem really short of 122 millimeter ammo for their D-30s, which is not surprising because they've been shooting it continuously. What's also interesting is that the fact that now, one thing that's strange is that, as I mentioned, these are real Ukrainian brigades. But if they're being trained apparently from scratch, that leads you to ask what happened to these brigades. It's strange. Are these soldiers who are combat veterans and they're just receiving additional training? Are these soldiers who were conscripted that month and starting from square one? Because if these are people who are freshly conscripted with no prior experience, this is not anywhere close to enough training. This is awful. This is not anywhere close to the amount of training you would need for someone with no previous experience. And unfortunately, Ukraine did conscript, or was aiming to conscript, an additional 200,000 soldiers in the month of February, which more or less coincides with the time frame of this calendar, the build-up to this calendar, which leads me to suggest that that's where these 12 brigades were sourced from at least partially from those new 200,000 men that were conscripted. Because if those 200,000 new recruits were not meant for these 12 brigades, well, what were they there for? Now, 12 brigades is not enough for the whole 200,000 men. Some of those 200,000 would be sent to other things, like to rear echelon duty, but at least some of them must have gone to these 12 brigades. Now, I've beaten that slide to death. Let's talk about some of the other ones. The other ones are interesting too. So this slide would be from, I mean, it looks good to me. I'm not in this field of expertise, but this looks accurate. This looks plausible to me. This is because you'd have, in a briefing like this, you'd have a meteorology section with somebody giving a briefing to the commander because weather is in that METTC format for a briefing. You would have someone give a briefing to the commander on the weather conditions. And in this case, they're saying that weather conditions are not terribly favorable. Right now, it's actually the end of March, when they wanted to be ready, the end of April, which hasn't happened yet. You're still anticipating mud, which is interesting because I've seen a lot of speculation about Russian offensives as well as Ukrainian offensives, and it looks like right now it's possible that neither side would even want to do anything at the end of April. They'd want to wait till mid-May or June even to have favorable conditions. So this slide is interesting for that meteorological observation. Now, this is an example of, so I mentioned earlier, you have the planning section. The planning officers are involved in this briefing. So this is one of several, so what we're looking at here is one of several axes that they could attack from. To reference this back to what they did last autumn, they attacked Russian positions from two axes. They attacked the Kherson axis and they attacked in the Kharkiv axis. Not quite simultaneously, but they launched Kherson and then they attacked through Kharkiv. So it's plausible that they planned that, knowing that Russia could, and with the manpower and equipment they had at the time, they could stop one but not both. So presumably they'd have something similar in mind for their next offensive. To compare this to World War II, the Eastern Front between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, in 1941, Germany attacked on three axes. In 1942, their combat capabilities had been severely limited, so that year they were only able to attack on one axis. So, and I think if and when this Ukrainian counteroffensive happens, it's going to be very important to compare it to the previous years, see if it's larger or smaller or the same, because that can give some clues as to what Ukraine has available in comparison to the previous year. Now back to this slide that I referenced earlier. This is this is also very revealing, and for different reasons. And actually, this is arguably has some of the most useful and important and revealing information out of everything I've seen here. And so I want to point out what might be the most damning portion of all of this, and possibly why Biden and his crew are so upset that this got leaked, is this box right here, activities for the last 24 hours and the next 24 to 48 hours. There are explicit references to American forces participating in Ukraine, or not necessarily in Ukraine, but directly supporting it. You have direct references to ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which is, of course, helping Ukraine target Russian forces. Of course, everybody's admitted that and boasted about it. However, just boasting about something doesn't mean there's any credibility to what you're claiming. But here, this is smoking gun evidence of American and NATO assets directly participating in the Ukraine conflicts. You also have up here a list of uniformed personnel in Ukraine. USA Special Operations Forces have 14 packs, along with these other countries. You have Department of State personnel, of course, which isn't necessarily bad in itself, but you do have uniformed military people, which Biden has said he has advisors there to make sure, observers there to make sure that equipment is going to the places it is intended. However, it's still not great public relations to have this out and leaked. The number of people in Ukraine. And what's also interesting here is this J4 logistics section, and this is actually very revealing. Unfortunately, these photos are not particularly high resolution, so this text is a little tough to read, but from what I can make out here, this is split up. This is dealing specifically with shells GMLRS for HIMARS, and 155 millimeter for 777 howitzers. This first row for HIMARS, the first column shows how many HIMARS rockets were fired within the last 24 hours. This second column, 9,612, shows how many have been expended to date. So for the past since the first day that HIMARS arrived in country. This, I unfortunately cannot read whatever this word is. Maybe it's on hand, maybe it's something else, but this is, I believe this means how many are left in country. Unfortunately, I have no idea what this middle column means. Unfortunately, I cannot read it. This column next to it, 14 for HIMARS, 2,746 for 155 millimeter, is how many they're firing in one day, the burn rate for one day, and the column next to it is how many days they have left at that rate of fire, and next to that's the date they actually run out. So as you can see, this is a really unacceptably bad situation for these two munitions types. And the reason I say that is, to be clear, I don't mean that they're actually running out, because of course the 18th of March and the 4th of March came and went. What I mean by that is their ability to replenish Ukraine's munition stockpile is not high enough, as they cannot even keep an emergency reserve. They're always scraping the bottom of the barrel, and they can't increase the rate of production on an adequate timeline to get that stockpile higher than where it is now. And that situation has probably not changed in the month or so since this briefing was held. If Russia does something that they didn't expect, if there's an offensive, they don't have nearly enough on hand to stop it or even slow it down, especially when you bear in mind that these 9,788 rounds, these 250 HIMARS rounds are not all sitting in one place. They're spread out, most likely spread out in different places to support different axes of combat operations. It might not all necessarily even be in Ukraine. It would actually, I think, and this is actually likely, that they have some of this stockpiled outside of Ukraine, in Poland, possibly Romania. And the reason why is because Russia can destroy stockpiles they find in Ukraine, but they could not destroy stockpiles in Poland or Romania without attacking a NATO country. So it's likely that some of this isn't even in Ukraine, and that's very important because the stockpile, this stockpile of rounds available is so low, and it's not co-located in any one place. It's not nearly enough volume to stop the Russians if they do something. It's like driving around your car with the needle on empty. It's just, you can't go about your day and your week always on the verge of running out of gas. And it's the same thing with the war. You can't always be this low on ammunition. It's just unacceptable. Also, I did previously write specifically about HIMARS twice. This is my most recent one. I had written specifically about HIMARS in October. And at the time I predicted, I just made an assessment based off of the daily battle damage assessments publicized by the Russian MOD and the number of publicly stated HIMARS shipments to Ukraine. I believed at the time that the Department of Defense, the American Department of Defense, had crunched the numbers of how many HIMARS rounds they have and how many HIMARS launchers they can support. And I believed, based on what I was seeing, that they could have 12 launchers operating at any one time. Seeing these figures here, I think I was correct. That number of HIMARS launchers is in fact around 12, and it also means that the Russian MOD is telling the truth about the number of HIMARS they have destroyed. Because if Biden was telling the truth and Russia had not destroyed any HIMARS launchers, that would mean there are 30 HIMARS launchers in Ukraine. Okay, so tell me, they're shooting 14 rounds a day. 14 is nothing. They literally have more launchers than they have rounds to fire for that day. That does not make, it's like having 30 soldiers and 14 bullets between them. That does not make sense. 12, or maybe a little less than 12, is a believable number of launchers for the rate of rockets they're firing. It's just the idea, if assuming this leak is true, that it's ridiculous to believe that they would even bother to send 30 launchers at once. There's not even a reason to have that many if they're all in operation and this is all they're able to shoot 14. You don't even need 12. So the situation, especially with HIMARS, is looking very bad, and it's actually, since with dumb rounds you need much more, you fire a lot more of them. As you can see just from these figures, they speak for themselves. It's actually just as bad, maybe worse, with the dumb rounds. So that's basically all I have to say about this leak. If I got something wrong, or if you're seeing information here that I missed or incorrectly stated, feel free to let me know in the comments. I will also be linking to relevant information in the description below. Thanks for watching.